Every year, the CEO of Berkshire Hathaway, named Warren Buffett, writes a letter to shareholders. And often this annual letter comes out in February. So, fortunately, Sina and I are going to talk about Warren Buffett's latest shareholder letter that just came out on February 24. And you're listening to the Investing Mastermind Podcast. I'm Michelle Markey.
And I'm Signe and Michelle.
So, with the letter that Warren Buffett just released, he often releases it on a Saturday morning when the markets are not open so that the market doesn't have a strong reaction to whatever he might say in this letter. And Sina and I read it and were prepared to share our reaction. So, Sina, what's the first thing that stood out to you?
Well, the first thing, of course, is the special letter that Warren Buffett wrote about Charlie Munger, a tribute to Charlie Munger, which was absolutely a fantastic and quite amazing letter. I really feel sorry for his loss. We all loved Charlie Munger, and in this letter that Buffett wrote about Charlie, you can really see that how close they were. And it was sad reading that letter. It was beautiful, a really beautiful letter. It's in the very beginning of the annual letter this year. How about you? What did you think about the tribute to Charlie?
I thought it was really cool how the font was in a very special way, placed at the top, almost like medieval font saying Charlie Munger, the architect of Berkshire Hathaway, of how taking us through how Charlie Munger was born and raised in Omaha, just like Warren Buffett was. And I thought that was great that he mentioned, right away that Charlie Munger passed away just 33 days before his 100th birthday. And I think I think maybe Buffett wishes Charlie would have lived forever as well.
One thing that I noticed about this story, which is the first time we actually hear that, and Buffett writes that himself, but there's this story in this first part of the annual letter where Buffett tells about how Charlie Munger is really the architect behind Berkshire Hathaway. And I've actually always admired Buffett, or now is it really Munger, about how he took his biggest mistake and made it into his biggest success. Because Berkshire Hathaway was a business that Warren Buffett invested in, and it turned out it wasn't a wonderful business like we see Buffett buys businesses today. It was more a sort of a cigar butt type business, but Buffett bought the whole thing. And what happened was that it wasn't a great business, but Buffett made the big pivot and made it into a success. Now, in this letter, he says, well, it's really Charlie Munger that's the architect behind it. My own story with that, because I got so inspired from that story of turning a big mistake into success, was many, many years ago. I bought some internet domains. I have all sorts of my domains in my portfolio. Please do buy them, because my biggest mistake was, internet domains wasn't in my circle of competence. So now I have all these internet domains that hopefully one day I'm gonna sell some of them. I have sold a few of them, but most of them are just in my portfolio and I haven't sold them. And I wasn't really a successful domain salesperson. So I had to change that around. So I used one of the domains that I already owned and turned that into my business. And that was 100% because I was so inspired from how Buffett turned a mistake into a success. I wanted to turn my mistake of buying internet domains and knowing nothing about how to sell internet domains into a successful business. So that's a fun little story. And now it turns out that it was actually Charlie Munger's idea to turn the ship around and make it into a wonderful business. And it's also Charlie's idea to not buy cigar butts businesses, but to buy quality businesses at a fair price instead of fair businesses at a wonderful price. So that's something I took out from that letter as well, my own story.
Wow. Yeah, that's great. You were able to do that and see the parallel there and drew inspiration from this experience. So that's really great to hear and will be inspiring for a lot of business owners out there. And another thing that stood out to me was how Charlie Munger said to Warren, abandon everything you learned from your hero, Ben Graham. It works, but only when practiced at small scale. So it's funny how Ben Graham is at a different investing mindset, like what you said, the cigar butt style, whereas Charlie is more of a buy wonderful businesses at fair prices rather than the opposite of what Ben Graham said, to buy fair businesses at wonderful prices. So it's an interesting dynamic how Warren needed to change if he really believed what Charlie was telling him, and he ended up believing him, which worked out really great. But at the same time, I find it curious how he mentioned Charlie and his family did not have a dime invested in his investing partnership, and they didn't expect Charlie to ever own Berkshire stock, which suggests, I sometimes wonder, why is it that Warren Buffett's net worth is like over 100 billion, but Charlie's was only like 2 billion? And I think maybe that's part of why is Charlie didn't really own that much Berkshire from the beginning compared to Warren, and I feel like it's maybe Warren's way of honoring Charlie, that even though Charlie might not have owned as much Berkshire as Warren did, but without Charlie, Berkshire would not be where it was today.
Yeah, 100%. And it also said that, in the beginning, Warren Buffett really did not necessarily want to follow the advice from Charlie Munger. It says, with much backsliding, I subsequently followed his instructions about abandoning everything he learned from his hero, Ben Graham. But
Mhm.
eventually, he did follow Charlie Munger's advice and started buying the wonderful businesses at fair prices. So yeah, if you have the opportunity to go read the annual letter, I definitely recommend doing so, but also for the tribute to Charlie Munger. It's beautiful, and in my opinion, feel really, really sorry for Warren Buffett's loss. I can read here that how much he appreciated Charlie. And, he says Charlie should forever be credited with being the architect. It's actually, let me read that whole last section because it's actually quite beautiful. What Buffett writes is, in the physical world, great buildings are linked to their architect, while those who had poured the concrete or installed the windows are soon forgotten. Berkshire has become a great company. Though I have long been in charge of the construction crew, Charlie should forever be credited with being the architect. And it's so beautiful, right? Because, he's kind of right in the way that the people who constructed the businesses are forgotten. And Charlie, being an architect, he was an educated architect. And actually, the way that Buffett describes Munger here is, yeah, it's just really just a great analogy, in my opinion.
For sure. And you can see that play out in how Warren honors Charlie so much that his relationship to him was part older brother, part loving father. And I really appreciated when he wrote, even when he knew he was right, he gave me the reins, and when I blundered, he never reminded me of my mistake. So it just shows this deep respect that Warren had for Charlie, and Charlie respected Warren, and together they made this partnership, last and influence the culture of Berkshire in an incredible way of like, Charlie never put down Warren in that way of like never made him feel less than, which I think is incredible in any relationship. You want to be with people who don't put you down and things like that. So I think they were able to have a truly beautiful relationship, like you said.
It's truly amazing and also absolutely a great tribute to Charlie Munger. So if we move on and look into the shareholder letter, so the letter that Warren Buffett writes to his shareholders in Berkshire Hathaway Inc., what we need to understand when we read that letter is that it's not written for the general public, it's not written for the media, it's written for the people that own shares in the business that's called Berkshire Hathaway, so that we understand what happened in the last year, why did they take certain decisions, why other decisions weren't made. And it's really important when we read the letter to think of the letter in that context. So Buffett, what he writes here is that he writes this letter. This year, he talks about his sister Bertie. Her name is Bertie Buffett Elliott. And sometimes he's mentioned his other sister Doris. But what he does here is that he's written the letter so that they understand what happened to the business. He explains that he keeps his sisters in mind. And I think it was in an interview many years ago, he said that he imagines that he's been gone for a year, comes back, and then he has to explain to his sisters what happened to the business in that year. So that's how he actually writes this annual letter. It's so that everyone can understand it. And at the same time, it does take some time, at least for me to read. I think about it, I reflect on it. There's just a whole lot of things to unpack in a letter like this. What do you think?
Yeah, and this 2023 letter is jam-packed with a lot of reflections and what the shareholders should expect. Like he keeps mentioning many years throughout his letters that he focuses on the investors who trust Berkshire with their savings without any expectation of resale. So it's the same people who save up to buy a farm or rental property rather than people who buy lottery tickets or hot stock. So this is the kind of person that owns Berkshire, is someone who holds it for many decades usually. So it's these are the people who truly put their trust in Berkshire, and he wants to honor those people of that. And I really admire that Berkshire has attracted these sorts of what he calls lifetime shareholders.
Yeah, and I actually met one of those when I was standing in line at the Berkshire Hathaway annual meeting in May last year. Where I was standing in line, there was also a person who had been a shareholder for decades, and it was really interesting to talk to him, to hear about his story. He just bought into the stock, not necessarily at the time knowing what he got into, and just held on to the stock, and then over the years found out what actually he was holding on to and started participating in the annual events, and is now participating every year and know what a gold mine. And his wealth has grown tremendously over those years. He never sold, so he's very wealthy today, but he did not act in any way wealthy. He was very low key, down to earth. He would have never known that you were talking to a multimillionaire when you were standing next to him. He was a very kind person. And I'm not saying, that wealthy people aren't kind people or anything. I'm just saying you would have never known. He was very relatable. And yeah, he was standing in line like everyone else in a very long line in the early morning in Omaha, Nebraska. So yeah, it's an amazing crowd around Berkshire Hathaway, the people that are long-term shareholders. And I'm not a long-term shareholder, but I definitely plan to be.
One thing I like how he mentioned his sister, like many of the shareholders, we might understand many accounting terms, but we're not trying to sit for a CPA exam. And she follows business news, but doesn't consider herself an economic expert. And she's very sensible, instinctively knowing that pundits should always be ignored because, after all, if she could reliably predict tomorrow's winners, would she freely share her valuable insights and thereby increase competitive buying? That'd be like finding gold and then handing a map to the neighbor showing its location, is what Warren wrote, which I think is very funny how, a lot of people pay so much attention to either journalists or experts like economists that people interview. But a lot of those people don't know what's going to happen with companies. They kind of just are speculating a lot. So it's interesting how, while it's valuable to get input from newspapers or places where we learn about things, but we have to remember to think for ourselves and not just believe what any so-called expert might say about a given company or where AI is going or, whatever kind of hype that some of this might play into.
Yeah, absolutely. 100% agree. And he also writes in this letter that a lot of the annual reports are not created necessarily by the CEO, but from investor relations officers or the communications department. And what he writes is that they're forever serving up optimism and syrupy mush.
Hmm.
And I have a mentee right now that was actually very frustrated about some annual reports that she was reading because it was easy for her to see that it was just a bunch of fog, as Laura Rittenhouse calls it. It's not really the truth that they're writing, but something superficial or something that makes the company look good. Of course, to be transparent, Buffett also got help. I believe it was Carol Loomis that helped him write the letter for some years, but he is being honest about the business. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of that honesty later. But it's something that we need to be mindful of today, that what we read in the annual reports sometimes is something that's fabricated by communications consultants or someone that wants to paint a picture of that everything is, all the grass is green here. But in reality, what we as investors need to look for is the numbers, which is also what I encouraged my mentee to do, was to focus in on the numbers in the annual report and not necessarily all the glossy writing. But also, if you come across a business where everything is mighty fine and dandy, you might actually say, well, this business is not for me. I appreciate the business, the numbers are great, but I really don't like that everything has to be such a pretty picture, and therefore I'm out. So you can always decide. For me, investing is really, it's about saying no to businesses and only find a very, very, very few gems out there and say no to a whole lot of things. So it's going to be a no, 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 no. And if they're very, very positive and glossy in the annual report, in the annual letters, you can actually say that's a no-go for me.
Absolutely. And so with some of that, that's where it segues us nicely into the section in the letter called Operating Results, Fact and Fiction, of where we get a really good economic lesson from Warren Buffett because he talks
Mm-hmm.
about a lot of things that Berkshire, as a publicly traded company, is required to report as per the Financial Accounting Standards Board and the Securities and Exchange Commission. But he tells you the things that they have to report by law, but other things that he thinks are a better reflection of what Berkshire is all about. So I find it hilarious when he writes something like, there's a worse than
Yeah.
useless net income figure that quickly gets transmitted throughout the world via the internet and media. And, I think it's kind of funny how he somewhat reflects on these conditions of accounting might tell you one story, but let me tell you the story from our point of view as the people actually running the company. What did you think about some of what you read in this section, Sina?
Oh, I love that section as well. He's been ranting about this for years, right? So
Mhm.
he's, again, he's pointing out that in Berkshire Hathaway's annual report, there are certain numbers that, for legal reasons, that they have to report on, but where it doesn't necessarily make sense in Warren Buffett's opinion. And what he writes is, all parties believe they've done their job, and legally they have, right? So he's like, I don't agree with this, but for legal reasons we need to do this. And so when people look in this annual report, it might not look fantastic. We haven't really necessarily done that great between 2022 and this year. Like, there was a loss in 2022 and now we're up 96 billion in 2023. But what he's saying is, instead of looking at net income, especially for Berkshire Hathaway, is to instead focus on the operating earnings. And, before we joined this call, Michelle, we also talked about that might not necessarily be for all businesses, but definitely for Berkshire Hathaway, because they own a lot of stocks in different types of companies. And in the net income number, there's some numbers that also follows stock prices. So what Buffett says is that the net income number at times can exceed 5 billion a day in the fluctuation, right? So that is, I totally see why you can't really necessarily trust that number, because the stock market, one day it's up and one day it's down.
And the reason why he says that it could be $5 billion a day, and that reflects the volatility of the stock market, because Berkshire Hathaway has such a big equity portfolio, and that net income figure factors in any unrealized capital gains or losses that Berkshire might have. So it can give a really misleading picture of how much Berkshire has earned. So I like how he said at Berkshire, their view is that earnings should be a sensible concept that Bertie and other shareholders will find somewhat useful. And he emphasizes, but only as a starting point in evaluating a business. So what you just said, Berkshire likes to report operating earnings, and the story that they tell is that it's been on a positive trend for the last few years. So if we think about that rather than other financial metrics that are required by the generally accepted accounting principles or GAAP, then you can come to understand where Buffett is coming from.
Yeah, 100%. And he also he quotes Ben Graham in the end of that section, where Ben Graham used to say, in the short run, the market acts as a voting machine. In the long run, it becomes a weighing machine. And with the annual report, we look at the short-term stock market fluctuations, whereas in the long run, the stock market is more of a weighing machine, so it doesn't fluctuate as much as it does in the short run. So that's definitely also worth remembering. And Berkshire's performance, when you look at some of these numbers, it's up 28% since last quarter. So it's, they're doing great. They have 167.6 billion in cash. So that's a lot of cash.
There are so many wonderful gems to uncover as part of this annual letter that Signe and I have only scratched the very beginning of this letter's wisdom. So what I'd like to summarize for now is that Buffett has said that he can't remember a period since March 11, 1942, the date of his first stock purchase, that he has not had a majority of his net worth in equities, specifically US-based equities, as he emphasized. And so far, so good. So what he's saying essentially is that America has been a terrific country for investors. All investors need to do is sit quietly and listen to no one. And I think what he's saying is listen to no one who tries to tell you what to invest in. So I think we should listen to Warren Buffett and his many lessons and all his insights here. But if you realize what he will clue us in on even more, especially with involving the story of his sister Bertie throughout the letter, is we will realize that if we just remain invested and not try to trade too much, we will more often than not become a successful investor with a lot of wealth. We just have to sit tight and make good investing decisions, which can be a little bit of a tall order, but even if we make some mistakes, it's okay, because we only need a few good investing decisions to be a successful investor. So with that, we're going to wrap up today's episode and continue in a second part of our reactions to this Berkshire Hathaway 2023 annual letter next time.
Yeah, what a great high point. We'll be back on Tuesday.
If you enjoyed the show and found the content informational, we would be super grateful if you would leave us a review and follow us wherever you get your podcasts, so you automatically get new episodes in your feed. We publish a new show every Tuesday.
The contents of the Investing Mastermind podcast are for educational, informational, and entertainment purposes only. None of this is investing advice, and if you need help in your personal situation, please consult with a professional.